Hey guys, so how do you decide how much food to grow for your family for a year's worth of food, or how do you know how much to plant per person? So right now in these times, there are a lot of us who are planning on growing more food than we ever have before, and with a larger focus on wanting to make sure that you have a year's worth of food and that you can provide family for your food year round. So I really want to talk about this subject with you and kind of walk you through some of those steps, because my name is Norris, if we haven't met, by the way. I'm the founder of the Pioneering Today podcast, melissaknorris.com, author of the Family Garden Plan and handmade books. And we've been raising 100% of our own meat here on our homestead in Washington State. And we do over 75% of our fruits and over 60% of our own vegetables for our family of four here on our homestead for a number of years. So I want to give you all of the tips and the knowledge that I can to help you create a customized plan and a game plan to go in knowing what you're going to be growing to feed your family. So some of the things that you need to take into consideration is your climate and how much space you have. So if you live in a really northern climate, I'm in a pretty northern climate. I'm about an hour away from the Canadian border up in Washington State, and we're up in the foothills of the North Cascade Mountain Range. I've got a shorter growing season in the summer for warm weather crops, and we don't get hot enough in the summertime for me to grow things like okra or citrus or sweet potatoes. I can kind of grow everything else, especially if I use an off-grid high tunnel like I've got back there for my tomatoes and my peppers. Now on the flip side, if you live in a really southern area of the country, you may have a little bit harder time growing things that like the cooler weather. So snow peas, cabbage, Brussels sprouts, kale. You might have to grow them in the more of the winter months depending on how warm and how far south you are. So the reason that I start with that is because what to decide for your family, you are going to need to pay attention to your climate as you're picking those crops. Now for most things, most of us can grow most of the things that we see or think about in a typical summer vegetable garden, like tomatoes and beans and cucumbers, summer squash, winter squash, pumpkins, all of those things. Most of us can grow that no matter where you live. But how do you decide what you're going to be putting in and how much per person? So if you are limited on space or time for your garden and you're trying to decide what the essential crops are, here's my breakdown and my criteria. One, it has to be something that my family likes to eat. So if my family, for example, my family does not like carrots. Now, I love carrots and I can sneak them into some different broths and different things like that. But on whole, just like roasted candied carrots, I don't know why they don't love them. They're one of my favorites, but the majority of my family doesn't like it. So I do grow some carrots, but I don't grow a ton. So the reason I share that example with you is because you want to make sure that you're planting practical things, especially in light of everything that's going on right now. Your family is going to be maybe potentially having to survive off of what you plant or really dependent upon what you're growing at home. So I look at my staple crops first and I make sure that I've got enough of them planted to take my family through a year. What do I mean by those staple crops? Well, I mean by things that I can actually create meals out of and that also provide quite a bit of calories and or nutrients. I also look at plants that are going to produce multiple items for me to harvest versus just a one and done thing. So I love onions, but in the space that I'm planting an onion, it's going to be a larger onion when I pull it out. But when I put that onion set or from seed in, it's just one onion. Whereas if I take that same amount of space and I plant a pole bean, I'm going to be getting a lot more food for my family off of that one plant than I am by doing that root crop. Some other great examples of this are, of course, your vining out plants that produce a lot per item. So your summer squash, your winter squash, that's going to be things like pumpkins and cucumbers and zucchini. We all know that, zucchini usually are so prolific that roll up your car windows at night, lock your doors so people aren't depositing them and giving them to you in the middle of the night because we have too many. So things like that. Whereas like a corn, we don't actually grow corn. One, because we don't eat a ton of corn unless it's fresh corn on the cob we like, but I don't use a ton of corn in my cooking. And usually for the space that corn takes, you also need to plant corn in blocks so that it can pollinate more effectively. You're only going to get, depending upon the variety, sometimes 2-3 ears of corn, and it takes out a lot of valuable space. So I really focus on green beans and specifically a pole bean. You're going to get more harvest off of a pole bean variety than you are a bush bean variety. I also focus on tomatoes. I'm going to get a lot of tomatoes off of just one plant. And I can take those tomatoes and create so many bases of so many meals off of those tomatoes. So of course, pasta sauce, spaghetti sauce. I can make tomato soup out of it, which would actually be a meal almost in itself. I can mix it with some broth or some other items to create a meal there. I can put it into my chilies. I can do the whole canned tomatoes and make those into casseroles and just so many different things. And I can make pizza sauce. So you can see where I'm going there. Tomatoes are very, very versatile, and you're going to get a lot per plant. And so those are things that I focus on first. For your root crops, for example, a potato is something that you're going to get multiple of per plant. You also get, it's a calorie dense, you're going to get a lot of calories. And then like I said, with green beans, which are green beans, if you let them mature, one, you have a seed there, so we do seed saving. But you also have a dried shell bean, and you can do dry shelled varieties. We do what we call an October bean. It's a bean that my family's been seed saving for over 100 years. It's very similar to like a cranberry or it's an Italian, we call them October beans, but I know it's closely related just by the way that they look and they grow to I think it's a Borelli. I'm probably saying it wrong. Bortelli. Anyways. Heirloom bean. But I'm sharing that because dried beans, as we know, have a lot of calories in them, and they're things that are going to help fill us up. And then we've got some of the other things that we can supplement for some of those other nutrients. Like kale is got packed lots of vitamins and different things in there. It can be great. With one kale plant, you get so many leaves per plant, but is it something that you're going to be able to create an entire meal out of? Now, I'm not saying don't plant it, but if you're limited on space, that's how I look at and kind of my criteria for deciding which of these crops am I going to be growing a lot of that's really going to feed my family in multiple different ways for a lot of our different meals. So as you can see, my top ones, of course, are tomatoes, green beans, and then shelled beans. And then I start to do our squash. So our summer squash with cucumbers. Of course, I can turn that into pickles and to relish, and we just like to eat cucumbers. They're fairly prolific. Zucchini we do more fresh eating, though I will preserve some. I'll dehydrate it and freeze some of it to use in cooking later throughout the year. Pumpkin, sugar pie pumpkins are very prolific. They cure and they last really well. I make pumpkin soup out of them, of course, pumpkin pie. So there's a lot of, just look at really what your family is eating and pick those that provide a lot per item. But how much of each plant then do you need to plant per person to feed your family? So knowing how much to plant per person, there are general guidelines that I'm going to share with you that on average are going to feed a person for a year by planting that much. But truly, and I walk you through this in another video, so I will link below in the video descriptions to those so that you can go through those. But truly, it's going to depend on how much your family normally eats of that item. So you may consume a lot more of one particular crop than somebody else does, and that's the beauty of growing our own garden, is we really get to tailor that to what our family likes and what we eat. But I say that these are based on averages, and it's going to vary, and it should, based on you and your family. So I have here in the family garden plan, there is a detailed chart. I also have a blog post, but you can get this chart for free. My publisher has given me permission to share this chart. So you can go to familygardenplan.com and download a copy of this chart and the worksheets that will walk you through each one of these steps. And I also have a blog post that has some of it, but you're going to really want to get the worksheet that's going to help you know how much you are eating of these different crops, your family already, and then how much you're going to want to plant yourself. But I'm going to give you the top ones here on how much per person on some of those top crops that I was talking to you about. So for dry beans, you want to estimate about 15 plants per person. Now remember, this is for a year's worth of food, and your average pounds per plant is 1/4 to 1/2 pound per plant. and average cups per plant, because most of us cook by cups and not pounds, let's be real, is 2 cups. Now I say averagely because depending upon the health of your soil, the weather that year, if you've been seed saving and so you have that plant more acclimated right to your climate so that it is a really high producer, you may be able to get a lot more per plant than some of these averages, but these are just averages. And then, you know, on the flip side, if you have poor soil, you're working on getting your soil improved, or you have a really off weather year, it may be a little bit lower. So these are just averages. Now for snap beans, so fresh, you know, green beans, which I can up my green beans or we're just eating them fresh, this is where picking that pole variety instead of a bush bean can really give you a big advantage to how much you're going to get out of that space, because a bush bean takes about 15 to 20 plants per person, whereas a pole bean about 10 to 15 plants per person. So for me and my family of 4, I've never bought green beans from the store. We always raise enough for both our seed bean and then for me to can up to feed us. And I usually put up about 60 pints of green beans, and that is off of about 40 to 45 plants, and that provides us for our family of 4 with that much. So that's why I say those pole beans are just so prolific and you get a lot more. If you can't tell, they're my favorite. I know, I'm talking them up. Now, some of the other crops that we were mentioning, like I said, there's the whole list all the way from asparagus in alphabetical order straight through to zucchini. But some of the other ones we were talking about, potatoes, you want to average about 10 to 15 plants per person. You estimate you're going to get about 2 pounds per plant, or 4 cups per plant. And again, it depends on how long you leave them in, how big you let them go, etc. Now with our tomatoes, it's estimated of about 5 plants per person. Depending upon the variety, I recommend doing a paste variety, especially if you plan on preserving them. I love a San Marzano Lungo. It's an heirloom Italian paste tomato. A lot of people like an Amish paste or aroma tomato. I always do heirloom varieties so that we practice a lot of seed saving here on the homestead so that I can seed save from them. But tomatoes, averagely 5 plants per person and 5 to 15 pounds per plant. On that San Marzano Lungo, on the paste tomatoes, I will get a pretty good yield, and it's closer to that higher end of pounds per plant. You know, a cherry tomato, it's going to be a lot less. You're going to get a lot of cherry tomatoes, but they're a lot smaller, and you're not going to be able to preserve and make those into as much sauce and that type of a thing. So those are some of mine. And then on the winter squash, so this is per variety, right? So think Hubbard, banana, acorn, butternut, buttercup, all of those different winter squash varieties. Average 1 to 2 plants per person, and you usually get between 10 and 15 pounds per plant. Now your summer squash, so patty pan, of course, yellow, crookneck, zucchini, again, 1 to 2 plants, and you're going to get anywhere from 5 to 20 pounds per plant. You know, cucumbers, they're still a summer squash, but they're usually, especially the pickling cucumbers, they're smaller, so that pounds can kind of vary. So like I said, there's a complete chart here, and you can grab those for free at familygardenplan.com. I've got blog posts that walk you through this and other videos. That's kind of the steps that you take on deciding what to grow for your family and then how much to grow if your goal is to have a year's worth of that crop so that you never have to buy it again from the store. And the good news is, right now in springtime, you still have plenty of time. Even if you need to do your seed starting, if you're doing direct sowing, maybe you need some help constructing some beds and that type of thing, you have plenty of time. One of my most recent videos was on seed starting indoors. I've got growing a year's worth of tomatoes and starting those indoors and then transplanting them out, how to plant tomatoes so that you are disease-free and you get a lot of tomatoes per plant by the way you plant. Got all those videos. I'll list them for you below, and I can't wait to help you grow as much of your own food at home as possible.